The Ipswich River on the Massachusetts North Shore, a historic resource for generations, a scenic waterway, home to a vast array of plants and animals, and vital source of drinking water on the North Shore. Formed by the retreat of the last glacier that passed over the region some 14,000 years ago, the Ipswich River is a slow-moving, meandering river that flows through a variety of natural habitats on its journey to the sea. For thousands of years, the Ipswich River has remained an important resource to the plants, animals, and people of this region. But the future of the river is uncertain. Will the thirst of growing communities surrounding the river create a demand this fragile system can no longer support? This is the story of the Ipswich River. The headwaters of the Ipswich River begin in Burlington and Wilmington. From here, it flows over 40 miles through forests, swamps, and a dozen cities and towns on its journey to the sea. Along the way, creeks, streams, and water flowing underground known as groundwater join the river and provide additional flow that helps maintain current throughout the length of the river. Historically, the river held great value to native people of the region, who found many resources tied to its waters and surrounding wetlands. Besides the tremendous populations of fish, many open areas along the river were found to be prime locations for farming and for hunting.
The Indians farmed along it, and they farmed here in Middleton, we know that, and the bottoms, in the floodplains. And then, so when the English came in, this wasn't heavily forested like people tend to think. There was a lot of open land, because the Indians used to burn twice a year.
With the arrival of Europeans came many changes to the land and the river. Most of the remaining forests in the region were cut down to provide lumber for homes and firewood. Farms spread out over the countryside, and fields of crops and pasture land covered the landscape nearly from horizon to horizon. But these changes to the landscape wouldn't remain.
Then the Industrial Revolution came along, and it went from agriculture slowly back into woods as they abandoned the farms.
Throughout history, the Ipswich River has been the basis for economic development in the region, providing food, water, power, and transportation to the various peoples who have lived here. Its abundant fisheries have been economically important for centuries, and the extensive clam beds in the estuary continue to be significant to the regional economy. Even today, the river continues to play an important role in attracting businesses and residents to the area. The riverscapes, scenic vistas, and natural areas along the river draw families and school groups, as well as others, to its waters and shores for paddling, picnicking, or enjoying a leisurely stroll along its lush banks. But the most important human aspect of the river is that it supplies quality drinking water to the over 330,000 people living in the surrounding communities. Many find it surprising that the high quality of the water that flows in the Ipswich River is closely tied to its biological health. Various plants and animals that inhabit the Ipswich River and its surrounding wetlands filter and clean the water as it passes by them. Adjacent ponds, backwaters, and other marshy areas along the river temporarily slow the river and allow particles traveling in the water column to settle out, further cleansing the water. The delicate biological system that creates balance and maintains the health of the Ipswich River is quite complex. Throughout this system, problems exist that could upset the balance and affect the entire river system. Although these problems are numerous, they point to a single cause. During the summer months, when the river is at a naturally low level, excessive water use by the communities surrounding the Ipswich is reducing the flow of water in the river to dangerously low levels, affecting local populations of plants and animals and threatening the long-term health of the river itself. A series of studies have been conducted by numerous groups over the last decade to learn more about these problems and some of the effects they have on the river system.
The Ipswich River Watershed Association has spent quite a bit of the last 10 years documenting the condition of the Ipswich River, the water quality and the flow conditions. And that was in part an effort to identify the causes and the environmental impacts of its very serious low flow problems. So we felt first that we had to do some solid science.
A series of studies have been conducted over the last decade to learn more about these problems and some of the effects they have on the river system. Among these was a study conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey and the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, which took a look at the aquatic communities and the specific fish species found in the Ipswich River. Typically in a river like the Ipswich, you would expect to find particular species characteristically found in other rivers with a similar profile. But the results of this study showed a much different picture.
What they determined was that the Ipswich River fish community reflects what is typical of a community that would be found in a pond. So it's a warm water fish community, rather than the kind of community you might expect in a river system such as the Ipswich. So there's been a major change in the fish community as a result of low flows. So the river is essentially reduced to a series of ponds, probably about every other year. Some of the species that are more typical of ponds are things such as panfish, bluegills, pumpkin seeds, fish of that nature. River system, river type fish would be things such as brook trout and fall fish.
In these situations where low flows cause ponding of the river, the still water contained in these pools warms up, and its ability to hold oxygen decreases. Aquatic organisms move into these pools to avoid drying up, but as their numbers increase in the limited space, they are faced with the stress of high densities in a place with limited food and a decreased level of oxygen. Organisms left in this situation for extended periods will face high levels of mortality, further degrading the water quality. Understanding how fish populations are affected by the problems associated with low flows can help us predict other issues going on in the river. Another way in which certain fish populations have changed over the years involves migratory fish known as anadromous fish, which move from the sea to locations upstream to spawn. The placement of dams along the river has hindered their successful migration and upset this vital stage in their life cycle. The Ipswich River, which was once a major migratory route for anadromous fish, now only supports a minimal population.
One of the very valuable things about both the Indians and the English were the anadromous fish that came up each year in enormous numbers, the alewives, the shad, the sturgeon. And the colonists would vie for permits to seine the river in the spring to get these.
Another study now underway is looking closely at the effectiveness of the river to provide passageway upstream and allow certain anadromous fish species to complete their life cycle.
And then there's a study going on now by the marine fisheries people. They put in 50 fish in topsoil with transmitters in them. And they put them in their mouth. And there are receivers in 3 places in Middleton. And as the fish cross these receivers transmitting their signals, there'll be a record of when they pass. And they're going to find out what's happening to these heron that they brought up from the South Shore.
Information collected from this study will help pinpoint where fish are able to freely move through dams and other areas, and where the problem areas are located. It's easy to imagine the effect of low flow and segmentation of the river on fish trying to migrate upstream. This is another good example of how the multitude of problems associated with low flow throughout the summer combine to magnify the negative effects. Without adequate flow throughout the river, the filtering capabilities of the plants and animals also diminish, and the impurities in the water cannot be efficiently removed. Naturally, this means they will accumulate, adding to the stress organisms are faced with in the already troubled river. Among the most diverse areas along the river is the riverbank, the place where the water meets the land. Here you will typically find the greatest diversity of plant and animal life. Frogs, turtles, and dragonflies feed and rest along these areas, while freshwater mussels, crayfish, and a variety of fish species take advantage of the shade provided by the overhanging vegetation. However, when water levels drop, the place where the water meets the shore is pushed farther out, and riverbank habitat dries up. Void of rich vegetation, this new shoreline provides little cover, and many of these riverbank animals are exposed to predation, while the animals searching for the shady overhangs are left in sunny locations near the middle of the river. In areas just below the dry riverbank, rich soils now exposed are perfect places for non-native plant species to become established and threaten the rich native plant life of the shoreline, even after normal water levels return. Usually, these non-native plants provide little to the native organisms that require vegetation along the river for food and cover. When flows in the river are reduced, that delicate biological system that maintains the health of the river is no longer functioning in a way that it should. The river cannot provide the quantity or quality of water that is needed, and this comes at a time when the water demand is at its greatest. So where does the water flowing into the Ipswich River come from anyway? Water basically comes from rainfall and melting snow. When it rains or when snow melts, water begins to move. Some of it soaks into the ground and some of it moves downhill over land. In either case, the water heads toward a body of water. This is where the term watershed comes from.
The simplest way to think of a watershed is the area that sheds water into a particular water body. So if you picture rainfall falling on the ground and that being kind of a shedding action as the water flows on the ground into a water body, that area where the water sheds into the Ipswich River is the Ipswich River watershed.
Recognizing this allows us to understand that there is a close association between the condition of the watershed and the health of the river. Two very important factors relating to the watershed can directly affect sustained flows in the Ipswich River. First, when water is taken from the river and released back into the watershed, it has the opportunity to move through the watershed again and return to the river. But when water is removed from the river and then released in an area outside the watershed, it has no chance to return to the river. Naturally, the more this occurs, the greater negative effect on the flow of the river.
One of the most important uses of the Ipswich River is as public water supply, and as I said, 14 communities use the watershed for water. 2 of those are located entirely outside of the watershed. That's Lynn and Salem. And a number of other communities are largely outside of the watershed, like Beverly, Linfield, Reading, Danvers, for example. And when those communities use water from the Ipswich, that water is lost to the Ipswich River. In other communities like, say, Topsfield or Middleton or North Reading, the water is basically returned to the groundwater aquifers, so it helps replenish the river.